mothers who contributed to this book, ladies, gentlemen and distinguished guests to the launch of this publication, Babies Stolen, Releasing the Past, Mother Stories of Their Stolen Babies. I use the word thrilled to be launching the book hesitantly because the book describes an extremely dark chapter in Australian history and in Australian adoption history, but nevertheless it's a really important volume and the stories contained in the book really need to be told. They are significant for Australia, both historically and socially, not to mention at the experiential level at which many of the stories are pitched. I'll just read this quote to you. This book describes what was supposed to happen to unwed mothers when they gave birth and what in fact really happened. It examines the culture that pervaded the adoption industry and the justification used by those working within it to separate mothers from their babies. It also reveals how the notion of choice for unwed mothers was in reality nothing but an illusion to keep them shamed and silenced. This book is about the struggle of mothers to tell their stories and their fight to gain an inquiry into past adoption practices. But most of all, it is about their undying love for their children and their need to tell them that they did not willingly give them away. They were stolen. I'll be calling on Mr. Pat Rogan shortly to speak, and I'll give a short bio, but before I do that, Christine Cole, who was on the committee and poured herself 200% into this project, will speak and speak. You'll speak after Pat, yeah, I'm aware of that. Yeah, no, it's okay. It's all in order. But Chris has worked tirelessly on pulling this together and worked with many of her friends and colleagues and other mothers to present the stories and accounts that are featured in the book. And I think we would all say it's been a rather bumpy road and an interesting journey, but it is absolutely fantastic to be here with the finished product. After Chris speaks to us, we'll be calling on Barbara Mason and Joan Cushion to come and say a few words, and then Mary Griffin will make some closing comments. But before we do that, I'll just tell you a little bit about Pat Rogan. He was a member of State Parliament for 25 years, and during this period he was Shadow Minister for Minerals and Energy, Acting Speaker, Deputy Chairman of the Parliamentary Accounts Committee and Parliamentary Secretary for the Environment. Chaired a number of parliamentary select committees together with various government committees, including the government's four-term school year working party. He was also instrumental in having the Chelmsford Royal Commission established, and he has served on the New South Wales Medical Board and the New South Wales Privacy Committee. He has also served as Chairman of Clubs New South Wales, Chairman of Club Keno Holdings Proprietary Limited, Chairman of Government's Club Industry Advisory Council, President, Clubs Australia and New Zealand, President, Federation of Community Sporting and Workers Club, Director of the New South Wales Institute of Sport, Director of Club Plus Industry Superannuation Fund, and Director of Revesby Workers Club. So that's quite an impressive credential. So I'll now call on you, Pat, to come and say a few words.
Thank you very much for the introduction. What I didn't say is one of the committees I had the privilege or honours chairing that I think I drew the short straw, and that was the committee inquiring into prostitution in New South Wales. And I went home and told my wife that the Premier asked me to chair that. Her immediate response was, what the heck would they ask you to do? And of course my immediate response was, who else could they trust with this mission? She didn't believe it, nobody else had a sense. Could I just say too, before I address myself specifically to launching Chris's book, that with the remarks I make, I don't want to make any reflection upon current day officers of the various my time in Parliament. They do an extraordinarily difficult job in extraordinarily difficult circumstances, and they really, I don't know how they do it, particularly those associated with community services and the like. I'm not sure what the burnout rate is there, but it must be quite enormous. So what I'm addressing, and I'm sure Chris's book addresses, is the extraordinary circumstances that prevailed in that period of time when mothers were being denied the right which every mother should have, and that is to have their own child. And I guess to look at that period of time and now where we are at the moment and say what can we do now to address those wrongs. And really that's what the book is all about, and that's what my remarks go to today. On the 13th of February of this year, the Prime Minister of Australia, the Honourable Kevin Rudd, spoke to the nation on behalf of the Australian people and issued a moving and heartfelt apology to the Indigenous people of our country for the mistreatment of those who were of the stolen generation, which, as he correctly pointed out, was a blemished chapter in our nation's history. This apology was, in my view, and that of the great majority of Australians, a correct and overdue acknowledgement of past wrongs committed over a long period of our history to a section of our society who had committed no crime, but because they were black, had their babies and young children removed and placed into adoption with white families. This wrong, and the apology delivered by the Prime Minister in Federal Parliament, was a significant step towards the healing process so necessary to give some comfort to those who were so grievously wronged by the actions of those in the past who perpetrated these acts. There was, however, during this period of terrible injustice to Indigenous people, pain, psychological brainwashing, betrayal of trust, manipulation of vulnerable, frightened but trusting young white mothers who were having their babies removed and also given to white families. This then is the story outlined by Chris Cole, whose book, Releasing the Past, Mother Stories of Their Stolen Babies, I have the privilege of launching here tonight. Writing in the foreword, Dr. Geoffrey A. Rickaby, a member of the Faculty of Child Psychiatry, states, "It is when the suffering of those most directly damaged by a socio-cultural disaster are heard that there is any opportunity for a nation to evaluate a malign aspect of its own development. In the instance of the thousands of Australian young mothers who lost a baby to adoption in the latter half of the last century, the distress and consequences are little known because they were dealt with one by one and at the time mostly isolated from their family, partner and friends." Dr. Rickaby further stated that, like himself, when he heard the accounts of the manner in which these vulnerable young mothers had their babies removed, he was stunned with disbelief that such practices could happen in Australia so recently, and there are tens of thousands of our population profoundly affected by them. It took him, he said, a long time to know there were a common problem and not an extraordinary events of one kind. Such was my reaction as a Member of Parliament in New South Wales when Chris Cole and a representative group of mothers approached me to seek assistance in having their tale of injustice highlighted with a view similar to Indigenous people who sought and were finally given an appropriate apology after their story was told. My role and that of my office with my personal assistant Margaret Como was small compared to that of Chris Cole and those dedicated mothers who had suffered hurt and great loss during their earlier and vulnerable years. Before dealing with some aspects of the book, let me briefly acknowledge the author, Chris Cole. Chris fell pregnant at the age of 16 in 1969, at a time when there was little financial support for single mothers and, regrettably, due to social attitudes of the time, little family support due to perceived social stigma associated with pregnancy outside of marriage. She describes being locked up in hospital like a prisoner for 10 days before being ordered to the maternity ward. Accompanied by no one, she was totally alone and at her most vulnerable. Injected unnecessarily with drugs which knocked her out for hours, she was at the mercy of the system, which was determined to remove her baby and give it to, in inverted commas, a respectable white family. No reflection on those families, but on the system. As a male, but father of 2 daughters and now grandfather to 2 grandchildren, I can only but imagine the pain a young mother such as Chris would be suffering. Not only not being able to see and touch her baby, but knowing her daughter was to be given to strangers, another mother and father. Let down by a family and betrayed by government agencies, Chris Cole never had a chance of keeping her daughter. Despite repeatedly stating she wanted to keep her daughter, no one in authority listened, and as she states in her book, the adoption gravy train was in motion and what she wanted was irrelevant. The system had stolen her daughter, they had stolen part of her. Again from her book, her heart was torn apart, and just like Humpty Dumpty, she could never be put back together again. But Chris Cole did fight back later, regrettably too late to regain that which was her right, and that of every natural parent, her daughter. In 1994, she applied under the Freedom of Information Act for her medical records. Again from her book, she found nothing less than a total betrayal by those entrusted with her welfare. What she uncovered was, in her words, an indictment of the society that considered itself civilised. Her medical records revealed that from the moment she was admitted to hospital, she had been given massive amounts of barbiturates. In fact, for a period of 10 days to the birth and for 5 days afterwards, she was systematically drugged. She was administered a powerful cocktail of hypnotics daily, beginning at 4 a.m. with sodium amytal, the drug used for deep sleep therapy, and I certainly know a bit about that. Then again at 10 a.m. and at 2 p.m. and chloral hydrate, better known as a Mickey Finn, was handed out like lolly water. Finally, at 9 p.m, she was given 100 milligram of sodium pentobarbital. This drug was later banned, and these days is only used to put animals down. Amazed that in their efforts to keep her docile, they did not kill their unborn child, the infamous doctors, I might say, Chelmsford doctors, were the consulting psychiatrists at Crown Street. Chris Cole did not stand a chance standing up to the system. And where were the government agencies who were supposed to protect the vulnerable? They shamefully were complicit in denying Chris Cole her rights. Whilst I've highlighted Chris Cole's story, and she has documented many others in her book, these cases represent but a minuscule amount of mothers who were denied that which today we accept as the norm, the right of a mother, Indigenous or white, to hold up and keep their babies. Given what is documented in Chris Cole's book, it is understandable when she approached me as her state MP in 1997 to outline the deplorable circumstances relating to her losing a baby to adoptive parents shortly after birth. I was appalled that such an injustice could have occurred in one might like to think were a civilised and accountable times. I might say that I also had a similar sort of reaction when the Chelmsford victims approached me, who were drugged and put into deep sleep, 26 of whom died in deep sleep, and another 28 committed suicide within 12 months of having come out of that deep sleep. So I wasn't unused to this sort of injustice, and the Department of Health, I might say, at that time I'd like to think it's much better now, I believe it is. When the Chelmsford Royal Commission was on, the QC who represented the Chelmsford victims said that the Department of Health went out there, inspected Chelmsford Hospital, and they were only concerned with the width of the doorways. He said presumably so they could wheel the bodies out without coming in contact with a doorway. So I could understand the terrible injustice when Chris Cole spoke with me. Immediately I took action to raise this terrible injustice in State Parliament, followed it up by speech with letters and subsequently a meeting with the then Minister for Community Services, the Honourable Faye Lopo MP. I might say other members also spoke, and that was because of the great work the mothers did on my advice and through Chris. Go to your local members, speak to them, say what I'm doing, and then get them to support you. And they did. There was Deidre Gruseman, Bryce Gaudry, and Jill Hall, who's now a federal MP. As documented in Chris's book, the Minister agreed to my request for a parliamentary inquiry in April 1998, publicly announced an Upper House of New South Wales inquiry into past adoption practices, which reported in December 2000. And I've got to say, as an MP, it's not easy to get an inquiry. To get the Chelmsford Royal Commission was an extraordinary amount of work I had to put in to do that. And to get this inquiry also wasn't easy. But I believe the case that we presented was overwhelming to the Minister. The recommendations of that report are documented on pages 191 to 193 of Chris Cole's book. I and the aggrieved mothers were delighted to have the inquiry established. I refer to a number of the recommendations, in particular recommendation 16, which calls on the New South Wales Government to issue a public acknowledgement that past adoption practices were misguided and that on occasions unethical or unlawful. And these practices may have occurred, causing lasting suffering for many mothers, fathers, adoptees and their families. Let me state quite equivocally that such practices did occur. Where the report says they may have occurred, they did occur, and evidence of these unlawful practices are documented in the book being launched here tonight. Recommendation 17 calls on department, private agencies, churches, hospitals, professionals, organisations and individuals involved in past adoption practices to be encouraged to issue a formal apology to the mothers, fathers, adoptees and their families who have suffered as a result of past adoption practices. At the introduction of my speech, I referred to the fulsome apology provided by the Prime Minister to Indigenous people who had their babies removed. Surely now, given the terrible injustice and suffering by white mothers numbering tens of thousands, is it not now appropriate time for governments, both state and national, to issue a similar apology to white mothers who suffer